Now, let's welcome Dr. Zou Zou Kuzyk, a coastal oceanographer from the University of Manitoba.
Am I recognizable up there? That's me. I guess I'm pretty recognizable. Slightly cleaned up. I'm really happy to be here today just to say a few words about what does it mean that Hudson Bay and James Bay is Canada's great inland sea. What does that really mean? What's unique and special about this place? And why do we need to try to look after it in the future? When you see it on a map like that, you see not only the size of Hudson Bay and James Bay, but also the size of the watershed that surrounds it. The massive area, throughout all of central Canada there, 5 provinces and 1 territory that send their rivers down so that they ultimately end up in Hudson Bay and James Bay. I'm from Winnipeg, and the rivers that flow through the city of Winnipeg ultimately find their way down to Hudson Bay and James Bay. And so what we do in the watershed, what we do in Winnipeg, what we do throughout Northern Ontario and all these regions, it does matter for these areas downstream. One of the other really seminal features of Hudson Bay and James Bay is the ice cover, and we'll talk a little bit about that. In many ways, we think of Hudson Bay and James Bay being pristine, relatively pristine, compared to inland seas that you would find around the rest of the world. There are some exceptions, some local exceptions, but in many ways, when we think of local human activities, adding pollutants, things like this, when we think of inland seas across the rest of the world, Hudson Bay and James Bay are still very, very special in that way. What we've been thinking about a lot in the last 20, 30, 40 years, however, is the ice cover and climate change. The ice, there is a lot less ice in James Bay and Hudson Bay today than there was 40 years ago. Every year, still the ice forms and lasts through the winter and melts, but every year it's forming later and it's melting earlier. At least on average, we now talk about how Hudson Bay, James Bay, that used to have 124 ice-free days, now there's 147 ice-free days. So if you were here for the earlier polar bear talk, we know that this has implications for polar bears. It has implications for every living component of the Hudson Bay and James Bay system. And it also matters tremendously for the lands around the bay. The ice cover and the rivers that come into the bay, they affect the circulation, the saltiness of the surface waters, the temperature of the surface waters. And for all the community members who live around the bay, it affects their activities on the coast, whether there's ice, whether there's open water, whether it's cold, whether it's hot and buggy. We also can't talk about climate change and a loss of sea ice in Hudson Bay and James Bay without thinking about the possible impacts for the Hudson Bay lowlands. The permafrost comes farther south into Canada, farther south in Canada around Hudson Bay and James Bay than it does virtually anywhere else in the world. And associated with that Hudson Bay lowlands are these great peatlands that are holding so much of Canada's soil carbon. Right? So there's a tremendous carbon store there, and a really open question, a really important question is how is that area, how is that part of the watershed going to change with warming, with thawing of permafrost? One possible implication of the warming and the thawing is that elements like carbon will be increasingly transferred more and more from the land into the rivers and then carried downstream, ultimately potentially affecting the food web and the ecosystem and the fish that people harvest in this really productive area. Hudson Bay and James Bay are also known all around the world for the large numbers of belugas that inhabit this area. And large numbers of beluga are often seen much like this in the sort of murky waters. If you listen right now, you may hear some sounds of belugas that were recorded near Peawanuck this summer by Sam Hunter and Abigail Long, a graduate student. And she and her research group are in the process of analyzing those sounds to better understand how the beluga are interacting and making use of that coastal habitat. So as you can see, we're in a process of sort of building our knowledge base about how this interconnected land, coastal, ocean system works and what these interrelationships mean and how they will change. No one sees the changes or has more concern about the changes going on in the system more so than the coastal community members. And we're really privileged to be working with many community members. You might recognize Sam Hunter in the back there. Many community members that are leading and driving forward research into these areas that really haven't been looked at seriously by scientists for 50 years. So the Cree knowledge that's contributing to building this knowledge base is absolutely priceless. I just want to come back to this image of the watershed. This is from a Canadian Geographic article. It's a busy map, but the marine conservation areas that we've been hearing mention of are in the blue out in the bay. The green is showing some existing parks. But the red and yellow colors on the map are showing areas of past and current human activity, development, and different types of activity. There are also road networks shown. And I think as we go forward and as we're doing assessments for future developments, I think there are two really important things to keep in mind. And one of them is that what we do in the watershed, what we do with the rivers, flows downstream. And we have to remember that the bay, Hudson Bay and James Bay, are at the downstream end of those activities. And the second thing is that, climate change may compound local impacts of local activities in ways that we're still just figuring out. And we really need to try to look forward and think holistically to properly make good decisions in the future about the management of the area. So as I said, we as researchers, we were lagging behind. There were many years when scientists were not able to access and work in the areas, and we've been really excited to conduct a few expeditions, oceanographic expeditions in the last few years to try to add scientific knowledge into this really important knowledge base. And I just want to acknowledge all the many groups that are contributing and working together to build this knowledge base so it can be there for the leaders of the future to make good decisions about the management. Thank you.